morning and welcome. Come and take a seat. Looking forward to getting started in the next part of our service. It's great if you're joining us online as well. Why don't you say hi in the chat. My name's Sam, and it's a real pleasure to be sharing with you this morning. Now I'm going to start off with a question. And if you're joining us online or you're watching later, why don't you put a comment to what you think. But when was the last time that you looked at the night sky, and what did you see? And maybe you realised I actually asked two questions there in one, but I just thought I'd sneak that one in, see who's paying attention. But it has been pretty cold recently with some really good clear skies, and the odd occasion when I've been remembered that the rabbits still need putting away and tucking up in their sleeping bags when it's rather late. If I can just position it right, and I haven't set off the security light in the back garden, then you get a reasonable view up into the sky without too much light pollution. And there's been quite a lot of stars recently. But it was really when I was on a trip at university to Argentina. There's a few embarrassing photos probably coming up there, which my wife dug out for me. When we were in the middle of nowhere, miles from anywhere, and looking up to the sky there, I thought I was actually on a different planet completely. The sky was absolutely radiant with stars like I'd never seen or counted before. And I think you'd probably struggle to find anyone who would look at the night sky and not be filled or at least stirred with some sense of wonder. A bit like looking out to the ocean, I guess, in some way. But just allow me for a few minutes just to expand our horizons a little bit further. So what is it that we're looking at when we gaze up at the night sky? Well, the nearest star to us we've called Proxima Centauri, and apparently it's approximately 4.2 light years away. Now, when we get to space, we have to use different units of measurement because everything is so much bigger, so much further apart. So a light year is basically how long it takes light to travel 1 year, or how far it goes in a year, given light is moving pretty quickly, but it is a definite speed. And so if you do the maths, it works out about 6 trillion miles, so quite far. A bit hard to get our heads around. And our solar system, where we live, Earth, and the planets we all learned at primary school, sits within what we call the Milky Way galaxy. And astronomers believe there's about 100 billion stars just within the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way itself is this huge sort of swirling disk, and the diameter of that is about 100,000 light years. So again, I can't do the maths in my head now. That's a long car journey. You probably wouldn't make it in an electric car at the moment. And as this picture nicely points out, our solar system is just down here somewhere. So that starts to give you a sense of the scale. And the universe is so large that we talk about the universe in terms of the known universe. So that's basically the bits that we've been able to see with the telescopes that we've been able to build so far. But it leaves a big question hanging about the unknown universe. What else is still out there? And in the known universe, we estimate between 200 billion to 2 trillion galaxies. So the Milky Way times 2 trillion. So if we've got 100 billion stars in the Milky Way times 2 trillion, I'll let someone else do those calculations. But that is a lot of stars. And again, most galaxies, we reckon, are somewhere in the order of 100 to 300,000 light years in diameter. And they're spaced out even further than that. So it's a big place. It's very big. And we might think, well, if the universe is just created as a home for us, isn't it a tad oversized, perhaps? I mean, we can't really make room or make the benefit of all that additional space out there. And we realize just how small we are on this grand cosmic scale. Now, you may know about Voyager 1 in 1990. It was a space probe that was sent out into deep space. And as it was about 3.7 billion miles away from Earth, they got the space probe to take some pictures of what it saw behind it, just to get a long distance view, if you like, of Earth and our galaxy. And obviously it needed to take quite a few different pictures, and these were transmitted back very slowly because it's a very long way away, and stitched back together. But the resulting image was quite astonishing. And what we can see here, it might look, well, it looks very black on there, but just about make out some faint beams of light. And that was reflections of the sun on the Voyager 1 probe itself. But what we see here, what's referred to as the pale blue dot, is Earth. And you think, that's where we are. A tiny speck, or as one astronomer said at the time, a mote of dust, suspended within the universe. And maybe that helps put our lives in perspective. Not to make us feel small, but just to realize we are small. And how short really the duration of our lives is. Now, King David, he didn't have amazing telescopes or fancy space probes to send out. But when he looked at the stars and the sky, I think he came to the same conclusion in wonder. And he wrote this in the book of Psalms. He, which is referring to God, determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name. That's pretty powerful. And I think it's important, I want you to know this morning that even though we're on that tiny pale blue dot in the middle of one galaxy, which is a galaxy of millions and trillions of other galaxies only in the universe that we've been able to explore so far, that the God who created this entire universe not only knows the names of the stars, but knows each one of our names and knows what is happening in each of our lives. So let that settle in for a few moments, maybe give that some more thought later on. But I'm picking up in the next installment in our series we've been looking at in the last few weeks called Let Your Light Shine. If you've missed any parts, you can catch up on our YouTube channel. But today I want to look at a short passage in a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to one of the churches that he established, a place called Philippi. And just thought it'd be useful to give a little bit of context as to this letter and the life of Paul. Paul, he was also known as Saul. He's a historically verified character who's living and breathing, and much of his work is recorded in letters that we now have been put together into the Bible. And if you want to kind of read a bit more about his life and his journeys, then you can discover that more in the book of Acts. But today we're going to be looking at the book of Philippians. Now, on the map, we're going to see where Philippi was. It was a pretty major Greek city, and it was the first city in Europe that Paul visited and where he established his first church within Europe. But he wrote letters that we have documented to a number of churches that he established. So we have 1 and 2 Corinthians to the church in Corinth, the book of Thessalonians to the church in Thessalonica. We've got Ephesus, where we get the book of Ephesians, which is just his letters to these churches. We've got Colossians, Galatians. I think you get the idea how we kind of brought these together. But these can seem a bit remote. Obviously, many of us probably never visited any of these places. And some of them now are just ruins and archaeological sites. But maybe if we brought it closer to home, if we had the modern day Apostle Paul, we might have the letter to the church in Royston, or perhaps the churches in Baldock and Hitchin, or maybe Cambridge and Peterborough further away. This is what it was like for people reading at the time. They would know of these places, and although they might seem a bit distant and far away for us, that's all that they are, is letters to the churches that Paul established. Now, Paul himself had a radical conversion, and we've covered him a few times recently, how his life changed 180 degrees from persecuting Christians. They weren't even called Christians at that point. They were followers of the way, and he was hunting them down because they opposed everything that he stood for in his extremely stringent religious beliefs. But he had this encounter with God, and it changed his complete focus and direction. He gave up all of the prestige and power that he had obtained through his own efforts, and he dedicated his life to traveling around the region, setting up churches, and then writing to them to give them encouragement and advice and also correction, and has made a huge impact on history, even to the point where he was so gripped by his calling that he was willing to face not only many hardships, but ultimately death. Now, everyone has to face death, but perhaps not death at the command of Nero. I'm not talking about a dodgy coffee from the coffee chain. No disrespect to them, I'm sure they make very good coffee. But we're talking about the Emperor Nero. Now, he was not the nicest guy to be around. He's recorded as having his own mother murdered and his stepbrother. Basically, anyone who opposed him or got in his way, he would quickly deal with. And Wikipedia records this on the personality or person of Nero. It says, most Roman sources offer overwhelmingly negative assessments of his personality and reign. I mean, you probably wouldn't want that read at your funeral, would you? Maybe there wouldn't be many people there anyway if that was the case. It goes on to say, most contemporary sources describe him as tyrannical, self-indulgent, and debauched. The historian Tacitus claims the Roman people thought him compulsive and corrupt. So if you get hauled in front of Nero, you're probably thinking, not likely to go very well, is it? But even knowing that, even the fear of being pulled in front of the Roman emperor wasn't enough to cause Paul to reconsider what he'd believed in, to perhaps doubt or think, this is not going to go, the outcome of this is probably going to be pretty bad. Let me take a serious think now. Am I really committed to what I have chosen to follow here? And I think that's a good reflection on many of Jesus' disciples ended up with the same fate. But did they recount or give up their faith at the end? No, they didn't. And perhaps that's something we should reflect on. What was so strong that they were willing not just to give their lives to it, but willing to die for it? Now, the letters that we read from Paul aren't from him sitting sort of cozily in his armchair during his retirement years, thinking, well, how can I document my legacy? What can I leave behind for people to remember me? He had no knowledge that they would come to form part of the Bible, the scriptures that we now have. He was writing these to encourage, to spur on the churches that he had established. And particularly for this letter to the church in Philippi, it's very much one of encouragement, to encourage them to keep going. He's not trying to necessarily correct them or redirect them, but just enthuse them to keep living the way they are, aspiring them to reflect more of the life of Jesus and what he deposited with them when he helped to establish their church. And I think that's why it's so important to read these letters and then reread them after a time, because we start to discover more that's in them, and the more context that we understand, the more helpful it is for understanding how we can then apply these to our life now in 2023. And one commentary on the letter says that He, or Paul, is what who they're talking about, is above all concerned that the Philippians continue to make progress in their faith. Paul explains what spiritual progress will look like. Christian maturity does not come through special mystical insights available to only a few, but rather through the patient practice of the familiar virtues of love and service to others. So this is things that's relevant to all of us when we choose to follow Jesus. And at New Life Church, it's our mission to inspire people to find and to follow Jesus. We're not just a church for the seekers, we're also here to encourage you and to equip you and to impart things to you as we work out what it means to follow Jesus in our time each day in our lives. But we do orientate things to make it easy for people to be welcomed. We want people to come and feel comfortable and at ease, that they feel like they can belong first before they have to believe. And that affects all the things we do. That affects the types of songs we choose, how we set up our room, why we stream online. I think it's really important to bring in that dimension now. That I think long gone are the days where people were familiar with churches, that if you invited someone, they would know what they would be coming to. And actually what we found now, so many people who have joined us have been watching online, either live or been watching on catch-up, and then when they do feel confident to come, they already have a sense of what it's going to be like. And so in our day and age, we need to realize that dimension is really important. That's why it's fantastic that we're able to do that. So, if you do have a Bible, let's open it to Philippians chapter 2. If you don't, then we'd love to give you one, a Dead Tree version. Or you can go, if you've got a smartphone, you can search on your app store for Bible. It's very simple. And there's a free YouVersion Bible app. It has many translations, and then you can take it with you wherever you go. Highly recommend that. It's a very good app. We're going to be reading from chapter 2, and I'm going to start at the end of the little passage that we're looking at today, because that's the nice easy bit and the nice attractive bit. So from verse 12, I'll just read this quickly, is where we're going to start from, and the last bit is, here we go, in verse 15. Then you'll shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. I mean, that sounds pretty good, that bit. You know, it's going to be a good sermon today. You know, shining like stars. I mean, who wouldn't want to be shining like one of those 100 billion stars in our galaxy? I mean, that does sounds pretty good. I mean, not just saying, well, I want to shine for me. I mean, when we choose to follow Jesus, I think we have to accept and acknowledge that we're like just cracked and broken jars, and it's actually God's light that shines out of us. But wouldn't we want to be shining like stars in the sky so that people can see the light of Christ's life within us? But we have to see this key word, which is at the beginning of that sentence, then. So that gives us an idea that there's some way to get there. It doesn't just magically happen. And this is where it starts to become a bit more of a challenge for us. So if we rewind now back to the beginning of verse 12, we'll just go through these quickly. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence. So we'll just break this down quickly. So Paul's writing to people he knows. This is a church he's established. He counts them as dear friends. And when he talks about their obedience, he doesn't mean their obedience to him. He means their obedience to Christ. So they've decided to set their lives in a direction to follow the ways of Jesus. So he's commending them as you have always obeyed. Not just in my presence, i.e. when I was there helping to get things sorted, But even better, when I haven't been there, that you have carried on being faithful and consistent. And then he says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So we can get in a little bit of a twizzle here. I mean, what does this mean? I mean, should we all be sitting there being terrified? What does fear and trembling mean? I mean, is this what it means to be under the wrath of God? No. What this is talking about is the justice of God. This should be a sobering thought, that God is completely fair and completely just. But actually, that's kind of bad news for most of us, because the standard of measurement is not something that we could attain to. I mean, I think even on our best day, when the sun's shining, perhaps when there's no one around to irritate us, maybe we'd manage an hour without some sort of twisted thought coming in, or a remembering of that grudge against that person, what they did. That should be sobering. But it's not without hope. It's not without hope. Because he goes on to say, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Thank goodness. Like that cracked jar. It's God who works inside us to influence us via his Spirit, his Holy Spirit living within us. When we choose to follow him, he sent his Spirit to live within us, to help us, to be the helper. That's what the word means in the Greek. So he will be within us to help us, to will and to act, to influence us. He doesn't override our free will. We can still make an absolute mess of it, do that all the time. But he is there influencing us towards good, towards life. And towards what? His good purpose. Well, what is that? That all peoples of all nations across the entire earth come to know the freedom and the love that was freely given but not freely bought gift of grace, and to rescue us in our moment of greatest need. So, it's all sounding pretty good. Where's the awkwardness here? I mean, we didn't have much chance, but God's rescued us. We're going to shine like stars. Well, that sounds pretty good. Maybe we could kind of draw a line there and miss out the next bit. But Paul then goes on to say this: do everything without grumbling or arguing. I mean, we know this wasn't originally written in English, so maybe they got that translation slightly wonky. So let's just check across a few other translations just to make sure that we got this right. So the King James Version says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. Let's keep going. There's got to be one that can help us here. The English Standard Version, do all things without grumbling or disputing. They kind of copied each other there a bit. New Living Translation, do everything without complaining and arguing. And even the Message, do everything readily and cheerfully. No bickering, no second guessing allowed. But in which areas does this apply to? Well, sadly, everything, all things, no exclusions. But I mean, Paul's writing this. I mean, come on, he's living in some other reality, isn't he? I mean, we know that Paul, he wasn't married and he didn't have any children. So, I think he didn't really, I don't think he really knew what it was like. I mean, he hasn't been at our dinner table on a weeknight in winter when it's raining and cold and dark and everybody's tired and tetchy. I mean, surely he wouldn't have put everything there. There would have been some exclusions. Or perhaps in the back of our car on the way home on a long journey, everyone's tired, someone needs the toilet, someone's hungry, and there's always someone who's dropped a toy down the side of the seat that you just can't quite reach whilst you're trying to plough through a heavy traffic jam. I mean, perhaps He hasn't been in the classroom where you work or study, or your office, or your family home at Christmas, which is supposed to be such a joyful time, but it brings all those family niggles together. I mean, surely we're allowed to have some moments to complain. I mean, there's some hard situations there. I mean, if you look at our society now, we've developed full-on complaints procedures for nearly everything. I mean, you get a special case number when you make a complaint. You get a service level agreement. You know how quickly someone should respond to your complaint. And if you shouldn't be satisfied with the response you get, there is an escalation process. So you can go and speak to someone else. And then you can go through that stage 1. And then we can go to stage 2 if you're still not happy. And I mean, where do these things end? I mean, you can keep going up to the highest authority in the organization if you're still not satisfied. That seems to be where we are. Now, obviously, there are times when it's important for us to stand up and point out things that are wrong. I'm not saying that. But I think we all know what I'm talking about in our culture of complaining. And it's so easy to fall into a trap of thinking that we have a right to grumble and a right to complain. But that's wrong. Our attitude is key, which is why Paul writes this very short, very difficult sentence. Everything, all things, without grumbling or arguing. I mean, we can say kind words in a way that they aren't kind at all. I mean, we've mastered sarcasm, the extreme of saying things that we don't mean. And maybe we've come so used to expecting that everything's amazing that we never say praise, we never say thank you, we never encourage people. We only spot when things fall short. I mean, social media is a great platform for getting our complaints out. I mean, we don't even have to look at someone in the eyes. We don't have to be even in the same room as them. We can do it late at night. We can just tap away and send something out. I mean, we can even jump on the bandwagon. You know, there's 50 people already complaining about that. What's 51, an extra complaint, going to do? But just imagine how life would be different if we exchanged that grumbling, that complaining, that arguing with something opposite to that. If we swap that out with encouragement, with praise and support, how would our lives change? How would the places where we live out our lives be different? How would the atmosphere be influenced? I won't take a poll, but I wonder how many times a week you get encouraged. I reckon for a lot of us it would be 0. I mean, that's dire. Everyone needs encouragement. But sadly, our culture, we don't lift up people to encourage and praise them in that way. There's actually a desire to see the mighty fall. Somehow that makes everyone else feel a little better. I mean, I've never had anyone come up to me and said, Sam, you know, just dial back the encouragement, man. I'm just feeling so positive right now. You know, you just got to hold that back. I mean, you're welcome, but, you know, we don't have that problem, do we? I mean, wouldn't it be great to have that difficulty? So is Paul actually shielded from real life? I mean, is he just kind of sounding off these nice ideas and saying, well, you know, these would be great things to do, but he doesn't really understand difficulties? Well, unfortunately not. And he gives us a bit of a glimpse in another letter that he wrote to one of those churches on the map in Corinth. I'll just whip through a few of the things that he says. I have worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number and faced death again and again. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I've travelled on many long journeys. I have faced danger from river and from robbers. I have faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. I don't think my list of difficulties comes anywhere near that. And yet Paul can write, do everything without grumbling or complaining. And he says at the end of that list, it wasn't to gain attention or people's pity or to see how good he was. He says, if I must boast, I would rather boast about the things that show how weak I am. I mean, imagine how counter to culture that would be. People boasting in their weaknesses, not in their successes. But it doesn't just stop looking at the life of Paul. If we look at the life of Jesus, it takes it to the next level. I mean, if there was anyone who had cause for some kind of complaints, I think it would have been him. I mean, he's betrayed by one of his closest friends. He's beaten. He's whipped until the skin is stripped from his back. He has a crown of thorns squished into his skull. At his moment of need, all of his friends have deserted and disowned him. He stands in front of a mock trial with false accusations. He has the humiliation of trying to haul the cross on which he's about to be crucified on, whilst half naked. He's spat upon, he's cursed, he's called a liar. And then he endures the most painful death in front of crowds mocking him. But what I think is probably the worst thing in all of this is that he knew that this was coming. I mean, it's one thing to be like Paul or whatever's happening in your life to face difficulties that often come out of the blue or unexpected. But we know Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, before the soldiers came to arrest him, he uttered this prayer, "My Father, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." And there's many other references that predicted this journey of pain and suffering for him. He knew what was coming. He knew what it was coming. But how did he manage? For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. I mean, it's a lot easier for us to just grumble and complain. It's a lot easier to find the exit sign when we can see that things are difficult, look for a way out. But we're called to follow the example of Jesus and Paul and many others that we discover, to put aside our grumbles, our murmurings, our complaints, and to live in a different way. And that is what allows the light of Christ to shine out of us. When we talk about let your light shine, this is what it means. Now, let's not get too downhearted, though. It is a human condition that's been around for thousands of years. And despite whatever your views on human development and evolution, we only seem to have made complaining more prioritized. So let's jump back in time just for a few minutes. We're going to look at our friends, the Israelites. Now, if you don't know who they are, they were God's chosen people in the Old Testament, or documented in the Old Testament. Not chosen in a sense that other people weren't chosen, but they were chosen to bring the message of God to the nations of the world. But things weren't going too well. They'd been captured and enslaved in Egypt under the reign of Pharaoh. And the people cried out for rescue. It got so bad. So, as is usual, God finds someone to lead the charge, but not necessarily who we might have thought. This was Moses. Now, he'd grown up within the Egyptian palace, but when he saw one of his own people being beaten, he killed this taskmaster. He murdered him and thought that no one will ever notice. But that came out, of course, as all things do. So he fled. He ran away. He saw that exit sign and he thought, I'm getting out of here. This is going to go bad for me. And you may know the story. God calls to him from the burning bush and commissions him to go back to the place that he'd run away from. This might be sounding familiar in your life somewhere. God often calls us back to deal with what we've tried to escape from, as much as it can be difficult and painful. He asked him to go back and to demand from Pharaoh that he let the people go. Now, Moses wasn't too keen on this idea. He even asked that Aaron, his friend, was subbed in to speak because he didn't feel he would be a competent speaker. But it's a good reminder that when God calls us, we'll never feel ready. We might not feel equipped, because God calls us to more than we can do in ourselves. Again, it's His presence in us to will and to act for His good purposes. So, cutting the story really short, eventually Pharaoh relents. They escape through a miraculous escape. God parts the Red Sea. They get out, and their journey is to discover the promised land. A place for them to make their own nation and to settle. So you'd think, wow, this is amazing. They'd be celebrating how they've got out, which they do. But it doesn't take long for things to slip back. And if you want to read it, it's in Exodus chapter 16. And it says this, and the whole congregation of the people of Israel, maybe they encouraged, maybe that was it, maybe they celebrated, maybe they praised their leaders for leading them out. No, they grumbled. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Feel familiar? Well, why did they grumble? Well, I wonder if it was one of possibly both of these two reasons. The first being that their present reality, they're in the wilderness, it didn't match up to their destination that they had in mind. They knew that they were headed for the promised land, but we're not there. Maybe there's a destination in mind that you have. Maybe you've seen or you feel like God's called you to something, but right now it doesn't feel like you're there. And perhaps they were unwilling and unprepared for the journey. They wanted the shining like stars bit, but to get there, giving up, complaining and grumbling, they weren't so keen on that bit. Famous author M. Scott Peck writes this in his book, The Road Less Travelled. I often think about this. I'd love to teach it to our children. Life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It is a great truth because once we see this truth, we transcend it, which means we can get over it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it is accepted, the fact that it is difficult no longer matters. So the Israelites, they were grumbling and complaining because they're on the journey. But it was tough. But the problem is the grumbling and complaining wasn't just like in that car journey on the way home where you know you're going to be back soon and it's all going to be fine. And it cost you a bit of stress or anxiety in that short period. Their attitude led to them wandering in the desert for 40 years. They were supposed to get to their promised land a lot quicker than that, I imagine. but they weren't learning the lessons that they needed to. Their attitude wasn't right to enter that promised land. And when they did finally get there, a lot of the people who had set off from Egypt, who had been through that miraculous rescue, were either very old or had passed away. They never made it. They never set foot in it. Grumbling and complaining will rob us of where God wants to take us and will cast a shadow over the light of what God's put inside of us. Now, the Bible's very clear. We should expect trials and difficulties in our lives. And sadly, the more we study the lives of those people who followed Jesus, the more full of trials and difficulties their lives became. But what is it like to be around someone who's always grumbling and complaining? I mean, probably don't want to be around them very much, especially if they're grumbling or complaining about you. So how can we be people who turn up with a good attitude? We let God's Spirit work within us. But there's some practical things we can do that I was thinking of. In those moments before we go around to visit someone, let's check what our attitude is. We might think that just doing the works is enough, but it isn't. How we do them is very important. That's how our light will shine. When we're about to perhaps collect our children from school, just taking that moment in the car or before we get to the gate to check, what's our attitude? Where are we at right now? What's going on? Whether we're about to walk home through the door or meet someone, whether we're about to turn up on a Sunday to serve in a team, what's our attitude? Just doing the doing is not enough. How we do it is of great importance. But when we are around people who demonstrate that attitude, when they bring encouragement rather than complaints, when they're being praise and support rather than grumblings and murmurings, they're the sort of people that we want to be around. That's the sort of person that I want to be. Why? Because then we'll shine like stars. We'll be like one of those 100 billion lighting up the sky. Not because we're so great, but because we reflect the greatness of the one who created it all. If we want our lives to count, if we want our lights to shine brightly, then we need to be prepared for the journey. The shining bit comes when we walk through those hard things of putting aside what we want to complain and moan about and look for opportunities to encourage, to lift up, to praise and support. So let's just take a moment to pray as we come to a close this morning. Father in heaven, we look at the skies. We see your creation, the billions upon billions of stars, and all of the ones that we've not even yet discovered. The cosmic beauty, the scale is beyond our comprehension. But it points to how gigantic you are and how infinitesimally small we are. How small our lives and our problems are. And yet on that grand scale, with our lives lived out on that pale blue spot, just a mote of dust in the galaxy, that you, the God who created it all, reach down to our little spot of dust because you know each one of us by name. And you sent your Son to come to rescue us, to put your Spirit inside of us, that we might shine like those stars. And Father, I pray for us this morning. For those of us who have made that decision that we want to shine, let our light shine. Would you help us? Would we remember that it's your presence in us to will and to act, to fulfill your good purposes? It's not through our own efforts. Will we be reminded in those moments before we arrive somewhere? What's our attitude? How are we going to do whatever it is we're going to do? What spirit are we bringing? Where could we encourage? Where could we lift up? Where could we praise? Even if we feel downhearted and beaten down, we can give out because of what you have given to us. And Father, I pray for anyone this morning who's still exploring, who's perhaps gazing at the skies and wondering, where did all this come from? I pray that they would have their hearts stirred of the one who stands holding the entire universe in his hand, who's able to look down, not just into the universe, not just into the galaxy, not just to the solar system, not just to the planet we live on, not just to us, but into our very hearts, to speak life. So God, I pray as we go on from here, would we be stirred to let our light shine, knowing that it's your presence in us that will enable us to do that. That we wouldn't be like the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness, grumbling and complaining, but we'd live a different life, one that counts, one that shines. So help us, Lord, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thanks very much for joining us this morning. It's been great to be together. It's not raining, so that's good. If you've got children over at Howard Hall, please go and collect them in just a few minutes at 12 o'clock. Otherwise, feel free to stick around for a hot drink and say hello. And if you want to talk about any more of what we've been sharing recently, I'll be up at the front for a few minutes afterwards. But have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thanks.